unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I am here today with Mike Maples, who is co-founder of Floodgate Capital. Is it Floodgate Capital or just Floodgate?
We'll just call it Floodgate.
Just call it Floodgate?
Yeah.
Okay, and also Peter Ziebelman, who is not only a lecturer at Stanford at GSB, but also the co-founder of Palo Alto Venture Partners. So two venture capitalists who also have co-authored this book called Pattern Breakers, Why Some Startups Change the Future. And Mike, I think you also now have a podcast named after the book, right?
Yes, indeed.
Or was the book named after the podcast?
No, I think that we renamed the podcast to match the book.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, look, when we think about success and failure, right, we all would like some kind of rules. We'd all like to get some kind of guidelines on how to be more successful, whether we're founders or whether we're investors. And, you guys have both been fairly successful. And so when we go back in time and look at, right, successes and failures, we try to figure out what the heck have we been doing, right? And you said in the book that sometimes when you're successful, it's due to luck. Sometimes it's due to skill. It's kind of hard to disentangle those things. But if you go back in time and look at why you've been successful or look at why other founders or other investors have been successful, you kind of run the risk of overfitting, right? Yep. If you come up with some, you say, oh, like when this happened, we were successful. And when this happened, we were unsuccessful. How do you guard against just kind of basing some insight on noise rather than on signal?
Yeah, well, and it's even trickier than, you phrase it as a tricky question. It's even trickier, right? Because when you talk to successful founders, people tend to misremember how things really happened. And so people often remember knowing things that weren't so at the time, or making this
hindsight bias.
Yeah. And so you got to be really careful and thoughtful in the questions that you ask to tease out the facts that you're looking at in the first place, even. And so, yeah.
And even the goal, Mike, we're not trying to get a recipe. In fact, one of our internal mottos was the recipe is there is no recipe. So we're not going back and looking at successes and failures to try to pattern match and share that with the world. What we're trying to do is understand truly what happened in the ideation phase. And that's where Mike's, you were there. He saw so much of this. And the stories are not only good in the book, but they're revealing in terms of what did these breakthrough founders do that was different than other founders who had a great team, had great backing, but didn't make an extraordinary success like those few founders.
Yeah, one of the things that I teach in Berkeley is a course on data and decisions. And, I always start that course with Billy Beane, right?
Yeah,
the whole story,
yeah.
Right, Moneyball. And, that whole narrative was about taking the kind of gut feeling that people have, taking the kind of tacit knowledge that people have and kind of bringing it out to the surface through analytics. And it seems like, venture capital is an area where, it's kind of like the last frontier, like an area where it's actually quite difficult to tease out any kind of, workable algorithm that you could apply to evaluating companies or evaluating opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think that one of the things that we learned as we worked on this some more was that you could offer an explanation, right? So if you think about what makes a valuable corporation, I think most people would agree that it's a organization that has a set of advantages and barriers that it creates that enable it to persistently compound value over time, right? So if you said, when I'm investing in a Fortune 500 company, what am I really betting on? I'm betting on the ability of it to persistently compound its advantages for longer and more intensely than the rest of the world believes, right? Well, it turns out a startup doesn't have any of those things, right? They don't have a moat. They don't have any advantages. They don't have customers. They have no 5 forces or Hamilton-Helmer 7 powers. They have none of those things. So then what is the right explanation to think about to tease out startup success? And that's kind of where the thought processes of the book came into. So what we think with inflection theory is that you have these inflections that occur, that provide massive new types of empowerment. It could be a new GPS chip in a smartphone. It could be a new microprocessor enabling the PC. It could be a new large language model enabling AI. But the high order bit is that those inflections allow startups to fight an unfair fight. Rather than the incumbents having the advantage of the incumbency and protecting their moat and their advantage, the startup is now able to refuse the premise of the rules of competition and impose a new set of rules by bending the arc of the present to a different future. And so that's what founders do when they're succeeding, is they harness inflections, and they have some type of an insight that harnesses that, and then from that they create these products that change the rules and change how people think, feel, and act. And when they do that, then they play offense and they change the future. And so the thing that was powerful about some of the ideas was it did offer an explanation, right? It wasn't just we studied a bunch of things and found this set of patterns. It was like there's a mechanism for how it happens. The inflections initiate the mechanism for changing the future and changing the rules and letting the startup play offense.
And what we discovered is that there's the potential in there. It doesn't mean that that it's going to be a breakthrough. We truly came out of this, Mike. Wouldn't you agree that I mean, it'd be amazing if you could say, oh, that's a breakthrough, that's not a breakthrough, and do your investing that way. So there's still a lot of luck and perhaps intuition, as you said, Greg, and guesswork to determine whether you're going to fund a breakthrough or build a breakthrough. But having said that, we do believe there's these elements that can tip the balance. And Mike already mentioned one, inflections. Another element is seeing that the entrepreneur has an insight, something they know to be true that others do not yet believe. And we believe insights are one of the things that does explain a lot of things about startups, even before you get to the MVP and other ways that traditionally teachers like myself have described startups.
Yeah, I mean, you introduce this new language, right, of inflections, insights, and ideas. And, you know, we'll talk about inflections, but is it usually the case that the founders educate the investors about these inflections, or is it the other way around? I mean, do investors discover some inflection and then go looking for people, and then when they say, yeah, you know, I think this is happening, say, that resonates with me, that's kind of the way I've been thinking? Or is it more like, you described a couple of your encounters with these founders, and you're like, oh yeah, I never thought of that before.
Well, I would say that fundamentally we follow the founders, right? It's the founders that are leading. At best, we're riding shotgun. And our job is to be co-conspirators to them in the early days and to provide whatever help we can in them fulfilling their mission. But usually it's the founder that shines the light for us towards a different future that we end up believing in, that they found. But what I would say is that we apply the theory in our own investing, but in a slightly different way. We don't apply it for coming up with ideas. But when we look at ideas, you know, there's so many ideas and there's so much noise, you have to have a basis, you have to have a framework to evaluate them. And so the inflections allow us to discard ideas that sound good on the surface, but that aren't that powerful. But it also allows us to protect ideas that sound crazy at first, but might be the right kind of crazy.
Yeah, I mean, how do you distinguish between genius and crazy? I mean, you got to have a lot of false positives, presumably, in there.
For sure. And like when you're non-consensus and right, you don't know you're right at first. You only know you're non-consensus. But the problem is that only by daring to be radically different can you ever make a radical difference. And so you have to, if the more similar you are to what's already known, the closer to the average you're going to be. And if you want to be a breakthrough startup, by definition, you have to create a radically different future rather than a future that extends from the present, because the incumbents have the advantage in that scenario.
Well, now you guys said you invest in unreasonable people. You know, normally unreasonable people are, you know, difficult to deal with. And oftentimes it comes with some confirmation bias, right? People are unreasonable, meaning that they refuse to let other people educate them, refuse to let the world prove them wrong. I mean, how do you, I mean, is there an optimal amount of unreasonableness, or is there kind of a difference in quality with, there's good unreasonableness and bad unreasonableness?
Well, there's two parts of the question. It's a great question, Greg. One is, who do you want to back? And then who do you want to spend a lot of time with in terms of as a CEO? And
so jerkiness is orthogonal to unreasonableness.
Yeah, you may decide you can put up with a lot of jerkiness, as you describe it, for a good or an amazing end result. I have to admit, I believe life is short, and I have a lower tolerance for that sort of thing. I don't want to speak for Mike.
Yeah, my tolerance is pretty high.
But clearly he's done much better than me. So I think maybe it pays off. But having said that, we're in the book, we're being clear that a certain amount of what we call disagreeableness, and there's a whole chapter on that in terms of that founder, just as you said, has probably gone through life disagreeing with more than a few people, not just his investors or customers or other folks. But once they've established that pattern, they can still be disagreeable without being a jerk. And we have seen that. And so we know it exists. It's a perfect situation when you discover it. But I think the point of your question, sometimes you don't get that lucky and you end up backing someone who is going to build a breakthrough, but is a jerk. And so it's tough.
But when we think about the lean startup model, right? I mean, lean startup model is all about learning. I mean, I like to say that the CEO of a startup, that stands for Chief Experiment Officer. And so there has to be a certain amount of learning, right? There has to be a certain amount of correction, right? When you come up with some idea and it doesn't get validated, right? I mean, at some point you have to pivot and abandon the idea. So, I mean, how does one balance as a founder the kind of determination and persistence and unreasonableness with this openness to new data and new insight?
Yeah, so I think you want to be persistent about your insight and open-minded about your implementation, right, of the product. And so the insight is sort of like the raison d'etre of the startup, right? If the insight is something that the founding team knows about the future that's radically different than the present and that has the virtue being true. And if what you know about the future isn't radically different, you won't have a breakthrough. If what you know about the future isn't true, you won't have a breakthrough either because you don't have an insight. You just have a wrong opinion about the future. And so the insight is the reason to keep going. The thing that you have that's the one unique asset that you have. The implementation of your insight, a couple of things can cause you to need to make changes. You might be talking to the wrong audience. So you might have the right insight, but you may be talking to the wrong people. If you have a cloud computing idea and you're only talking to SAP customers on-prem, your insight might be right. You're just talking to the wrong people. But you might also have the wrong implementation. So in the case of Okta, they were talking to cloud early adopter customers, but they were showing them problem resolution at first. And they said, no, that's not what we want. We want identity management. So they came back with identity management. And so if you have the right insight, when we talk about pivoting, your insight, like in basketball, is like your pivot foot. And you hold it planted firm and you move your body by either modifying your implementation or modifying the audience that you talk to or some combination. But like if you have to leave your pivot foot, you're no longer attached to anything as a startup, right? You might as well start over. You might as well try a new idea or just give up. And so that's where I think you reconcile it. You want to be flexible in your experimentation of navigating your insight to the desperate, but you want to be fixed about what you believe is different about the future.
But I love what's behind your question because it's an art, both for the entrepreneur and for the investor, to still believe in the entrepreneur when you say, look, you need to change this implementation of this idea. Or when the CEO decides, I had one CEO that was running in one direction and all of a sudden he changed. And I thought, things are going great. Why are you changing? And it turned out to be right. It was a correct change. And I think there are and Mike probably has seen this more than me, there are those very special entrepreneurs that can hold two ideas in their head. They're completely obsessive about their idea, but know when to change it. Have you seen that?
No, for sure.
And I think, I don't think I could do that. I think there are certain investors that also have that in their head, that they can be so excited about a certain area, but then know that area is done, need to move on. And those are two qualities that are hard to live in the same person. And it's a very rare quality. So I love what's behind your question there.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you're describing a certain, I don't know, cognitive prototype that a good founder has. And I was wondering, since you teach in a business school and you've been a guest speaker in the business school, is that something that we can teach, or is that something that is more or less given, right? This capacity to be open-minded in the right ways and confident in the right ways.
I think there is an aspect of it that's innate to people, right? So I think that way back when, probably about 100 years ago, Pareto wrote about society, and he talked about speculators, and I think it's rentiers, rentiers. And the way I internalized that was, he thought that most people in the world were like rentiers, right? And they're examples of people who want to succeed through persistent compounding, or through, saving what they already have, or making the most of what they have, and, not losing what they have. And that's quite often the instincts of most people. And the speculators, he didn't mean it in a gambling sense, right? This was before Las Vegas or any of that stuff happened.
The entrepreneurs.
Right, like the speculators speculate. They speculate that things can be different. And they always believe that whenever they hear a story, there's always a possible better story that exists somewhere. And so, like, those are just two different ways of showing up in the world, right? Like, some people are like, hey, I want to keep what I've earned, and I don't want to screw this up, and I don't want to lose what the good I have. And there's other people who are just like, there's probably always a better answer somewhere. There's probably always a better way to do it. And so I do think that people are probably naturally wired to be one way or the other. And I think probably the minority of people are wired to be speculators naturally. I think most people want to fit in and be, well liked within the social dominance hierarchy.
And I'd agree with Mike with the provision that, and this is one of the aspects of the book, is we talk about noticing, Craig. And I think that can be taught. I think there are certain people that are natural about saying, oh, I see you've got our book in front of you, and it looks like you've actually read the whole thing, because I can see how the pages are muffled a bit there. And so they notice things that other people wouldn't normally notice. I do think, particularly in this world, and particularly as your question says, for Stanford Graduate School of Business students, they're in a world that has, for better or for worse, made them notice less, I think, about things, that they're overscheduled, they're running through things, they have an objective, and they're not seeing the things that may be serendipity, that may just come at them. And I do think, and we see this as a quality of entrepreneurs that you were talking about, that noticing is a big part of, or at least the start of that. And I would think that some of the entrepreneurs we tell stories about, wouldn't you say, Mike, really were good at noticing?
Yeah, and they're so good at it that they actually look at surprises as something to actively seek. And I've learned this from founders, right? Like, I try to journal each day now, and one of the things I ask every day is, what surprised you today? Just as a life practice, and I'm not an entrepreneur. I'm not Jack Dorsey or Ev Williams or Brian Chesky or any of these guys. But what we've seen is, a lot of people think success means finding out why something's not working and filling the gaps in what's not working. But a lot of times success is noticing something that's working better than you thought it should work, and realizing that you just earned a secret about the future, even if it was somewhat serendipitously. And so a lot of the examples that we have are, and we call it savoring surprises. But like, when you think about it, you mentioned lean startups earlier and running experiments. One way to think of an experiment is, I have a hypothesis, I run an experiment, I want to validate my hypothesis. But there's only one problem with that, which is if all you do is validate your hypothesis, you didn't really learn anything. You just underscored what you think you already know. And what you'd really like to do in an experiment is get more confidence in the things you should be confident about, but conduct the experiment in a way that you're going to get surprised somehow on the upside.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to modify the way I teach that part of my venture capital class, right? Because I always talk about, right, the CEO as this chief experiment officer testing hypotheses. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's not like they start with a hypothesis and then they apply for a grant, to do research on the hypothesis. I mean, what they're really doing is they're trying to figure out, right, what those hypotheses are, right, in a way. And I love this concept of the surprise hunter. And it reminded me of, Reed Hastings has this thing with the descent farmer, right? It seems like another attribute that you really ought to cultivate, this idea of like, actually shopping. And you quote Louis Pasteur, who said, right, that
luck is the prepared mind.
Yeah, luck of the prepared mind. So surprises are really only for the noticing mind.
That's right, 100%, right? And it's the place we learned it from was actually Scott Cook. So Scott, when he was running Intuit, when people would present to him a new proposal, he would say, "What surprised you?" And if they answered something like, "Well, we were surprised at how much upside there is in this, or how much customers like it," he always felt like, okay, these people aren't truth seeking. These people are seeking validation, not truth. These people have an agenda that they want me to approve of. Because how is it possible that you could not be surprised if you were an authentic truth seeker when you talk to all these customers? How is that ever possible to happen? And so, and that's where a lot of the great breakthroughs come from, is being surprised and encountering that surprise for the first time, noticing it for the first time, and then acting on it for the first time.
Yeah, I love how you described like an ideal interaction between a founder and an early stage investor. And, you said that the typically when the founder comes in and they've checked all the boxes and they've worked through all the, they've gotten the pitch deck template from Sequoia and they've, filled everything out and they've covered all their bases. This generally isn't as exciting to you as when someone comes in with something that's a little bit more, I don't know, half-baked, unformed,
wild,
work in process, right?
Well, not trying to match a pattern, because as you said, they've gotten literally the pitch deck or the framework from Sequoia or some other VC with good intentions, saying this is how it should work, this is how you should fit in, and you should say, here's your monthly run rate, here's your goal, it's up and to the right. And the entrepreneur, most of them will take that advice and say, yeah, I need to answer this correctly, just like they answered it in college and grade school and did the right answer. But we're looking for the entrepreneurs, and we're hoping to coach the entrepreneurs that are saying, I'm not looking for the right answer. I'm looking for an answer that no one's ever discovered before. So how do you do that? And you have to start with a different mindset. And so, Greg, you can imagine, in fact, Mike said it kind of neatly, but it's been a more difficult transition for me. I taught that method 10 years ago to say, look for a large market, look for the pain in the market. That's what I taught. And here, this guy comes up, talks about this different mindset. And I saw the reaction of our students when we tried out some of these concepts. We did a tutorial, a 390, if you're familiar with tutorial. And the students were saying, this kind of thinking changed their reality. When I saw that, I said, wow, I need to change the way I teach to allow for this different mindset. And it's not just for students that are trying to build $1 billion company. It's if they want to discover something truly new out there that there isn't, quote, the right answer for. This is we believe, the precursor that needs to happen.
Now, to be fair, I mean, the insights that you offer in this book, I mean, they are not universally applicable to all startups. I mean, there are plenty, probably most startups are going to follow that template. They're going to look for a pain point. They're going to, figure out how they can do something slightly better. I think you have a term for this. I forget what it was, like the just the steady progress. You talk about it. Some kind of incremental improvement. And, there's plenty of opportunities for those. I mean, you're talking about a sort of subset of startups, right?
Yeah. So I think what we're getting at is that if you look at tech startups, which is definitely a particular field, the top startup of the year is usually more valuable than all other startups of the year combined. And the top startup of the decade is usually more valuable than all the startups of the decade combined. And so the power law is real. And so if you're going to start a startup, the problem is that if you're average, you fail. If you're even better than average, you fail. If you're in the top 20%, you do only okay. And so what makes the sacrifice and the time worth it? It's to go after ideas that have breakthrough upside potential. And so what a lot of founders do, and this might resonate with some people listening right now, is they say, oh, for me to get one of those big outcomes, I need to start with a big market and work backwards to an unserved customer and solve their unserved needs. But by doing that, the entrepreneur unwittingly buys into a context, which is, I'm going to compete according to the rules already established by the incumbents, right? Because if you're trying to find white space in the available market, it's an existing market defined by somebody else. And so what we're saying is, instead of starting with an available market, start with inflections. Start with a new set of powers that allows you to not compete within current markets, but to change the subject and create new markets. And that the way you create new markets is you have a product that defines the market. And the way you have a product that defines the market is you show up with a radically different value proposition that nobody's ever seen before, that can't be compared with anything that's come before. And in order to do that, it just requires, like what Peter said, a completely different mindset, right? There's no recipe or set of steps you can follow. There's a belief system that you adopt, which is pursue things that exist in the future, that follow inflections, that harness an insight, and that can change the subject rather than be better than what's out there.
And that we're surely saying that's still hard to do. It's
it doesn't happen often.
Very difficult to do. And when you do take a swing at it, you're likely to fail. You're not going to come up with that insight. The inflection you found is going to be ephemeral, or something that is really not changing the world the way you thought it was going to change the world. But having said that, once you do figure out this, we could actually argue, I don't think, Mike, we'd say it in the book, so tell me if we're overstepping here, that once you found it, it's actually less risky particularly in terms of expected value, but just less risky overall than following a recipe that 40 of your classmates can follow, coming out with the same company, and you each think you can build a $10 million, $100 million company and sell it for 50 or 300 million. But you've got 40 classmates doing the same thing, and you're going to compete yourself as a race to the bottom. And so it could be argued that actually is the riskier approach. Now, Mike, do you think I'm getting into trouble on that?
No, I don't think so. I think another way I've internalized it is that a lot of people confuse risk and uncertainty, right? And so like, I might have an idea that's in an existing market that there's a clear need for, but it's a bounded upside idea. But like, I can connect the dots between the idea and customers wanting it and a successful business. I might, on the other hand, have an idea that's like Justin TV, right? Which is a reality 24/7 streaming TV show, which is crazy online, but it embodied a lot of inflections and an insight. It was a terrible idea, but a great opportunity. And so what we're interested in is not certainty about the future, because if we're going after a non-consensus idea, if we have a real insight, we can't know we're certain yet. All we can know is that we're non-consensus. But just because we don't know how the dots will forward connect doesn't mean they won't forward connect, and it doesn't mean that the expected value of the upside isn't higher. And so that's what we kind of encourage people to say. Just because you don't know how the success will happen doesn't mean that it's not way better odds to pursue that path.
Yeah, no, I like how you distinguish between the insight and the idea, right? And how the insight can be fundamentally correct, but the idea could be wrong. And so, but when you're investing, right, people talk about looking at the rider and not the horse, right? But in a way, you're looking at the insight, not the idea. And that oftentimes, and I know a lot of my students who have had successful startups, their initial idea was just bonkers, right? You look at it like, that's crazy. They're we're going to do this thing with blockchain. It's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But then they figured it out without changing their insight. They just changed.
Right. They lived
idea,
in the future. Right? In fact, it was useful to have that implementation of their insight, because they probably talked to customers or potential customers and really got a sense of what would work or what wouldn't work, and took those learnings back and did another implementation. And this time it was closer to the bullseye.
But what's your role in that? I mean, as investors,
hopefully stand back and let it all happen.
Well, I mean, is it really like that? Because I mean, from what I hear, when I talk to founders, is they say that the biggest value add that the investors can provide is to help them set their priorities and help them to, become better learners. I mean, would you attribute your success to selection or treatment? I think most of the book is about kind of identifying the founders who get it. But, that can unravel over time, right? So what's your role in helping them to stay on the track that they need to stay on?
Yeah, I think so first of all, I think that selecting the right founder and opportunity contributes to the majority of success if you're an investor.
That's like an understatement.
Yeah. And then luck may be the second biggest factor. So then you start to say, okay, as an investor, how do you add value if you ever do? And I think it's in more limited cases than people often realize. And so I like to say that 95% of the time, the founder should understand what to do better than I should, or I made the wrong investment. I bet on the wrong founder. There are certain times, though, where you just have some perspective. So, for example, I have a database of every startup I've ever been able to find where you would have made more than 100 times your money on the first check. And so I've thought about what are the most successful startups ever that did freemium or that did enterprise or that did subscriptions, or, what were the most successful startups that saved money for customers? What were the most successful that made it more fun for customers or that gave them social status or whatever? And so sometimes, because I've thought about all of those companies in great depth, I can offer the founder something they haven't thought of before, because this startup is their only startup, right? This is a one-time thing for them. Or sometimes I'll know what the issue is, we'll agree on what the issue is, and I will know the best person when it comes to that topic. But it's I think a lot of it is knowing when you can help, and knowing that if you don't know you can help, usually you're doing the opposite. Like you're just adding to the noise and the confusion that they experience.
Well, I mean, you talk in the book, and I think a lot of people are aware of how corporations get stale over time, right? I mean, it's actually one of the big mysteries. I don't think we've completely figured out. You talk about some of the biases, but there are relatively few examples of companies that have figured out this inflection point and acted on it. I mean, AWS is a great example, iPhone, but they're few and far between. How do you prevent that from happening to you as an investor, right? I mean, some of these venture capital firms have been around for decades, and one would think that they too would sort of, acquire some routines, that acquire all these biases against risk and against disagreeableness and so forth. So how do you stay fresh as an investor and avoid the traps that corporations fall into?
Well, one thing I teach the students when they're looking for venture capital is to not only think about the firm, but think about the partner that's involved, because you'll often find the partner will have a different philosophy, certainly than another partner at the firm, but maybe even than the actual firm's, what they say on their website, And so I think there is a difference in partners in who you go to. And and I include within partners, associates as well. There are people that are new and fresh or different and are willing to look at, and in fact, maybe chosen by that firm because they're different. I know Founders Fund certainly is amazing in this regard. There's, at least not that I can discern, there's no pattern there. And the founders that they've brought on all think differently. But they do have a common thesis and, follow some rules, I'm told, but not too many of them. And, that's really my point, Greg, that I think there's a difference between the partner and the firm. And I think that's the answer, at least the way I see it, on how they stay fresh, the better firms.
How come companies can't do that, right? How come companies can't
rotate their management more?
Yeah, like bring in these fresh people and have them make internal decisions in ways that venture capitalists do.
Well, we kind of get into that, Mike.
Well, and it's I think that what happens, ironically, is that it's the good companies that fall into the trap, because the good companies are excellent at executing their strategy. And they hire people who are very talented and able, and they advance in the organization because they execute the strategy really well. And it's like you mentioned bias earlier, right? The bias comes from a bias to executing according to that model, that set of patterns. And so ironically, the better you are at executing your business and the more attractive it is, the more you're likely to be stuck in current patterns, the more rightfully so, you're likely to believe in the current patterns. And so that it becomes very difficult to come up with a pattern breaking, sort of totally radically different strategy. And I think that there are ways around it. I think that Vinod Khosla has an interesting view on this, and I may not be quoting him exactly, but one way to think about it is, a company should allocate a certain amount of profits to initiatives that are likely to fail, but massive upside if they succeed. And you just decide what that threshold is. Is it 5% of profits? Is it 10% of profits? Whatever it is. But it's like the very act of trying to do something radically new and allowing failure to be okay, and holding the overall organization accountable for success because you take enough bets. But to say, look, we're just going to have a philosophy of making, not too big to fail, but, small bets that if they work are wildly asymmetric upside. Make that part of our culture, I think is really important, because otherwise you become committed to the existing pattern of how, the pathological thing that happens is, like, Blockbuster is a great example of this. What happens if the pattern means most of your profits come from late fees? Well, pretty soon you start to try to encourage your customer to return products. Like you start to act in ways that are against the interests of the customer and against the interests of compounding value in a real way. And you start to become more concerned about the institutional imperative than in creating abundance and value for people.
And we've seen a similar issue when larger companies acquire our companies, and everybody gets excited about the exit, but we tend to know the routine. The CEO will stay on, we'll have a contract to stay on for 3 years, but we'll stay only 1 or 2. And all of a sudden the product is absorbed, and the creativity and the passion and the zeal that they had before is diminished. And even though the parent company is, wanting to retain all that. And so acquisitions, I think, are particularly problematic as well.
Yeah, it makes me wonder. I teach courses in strategy and so forth, and it seems like that type of education is much better suited for teaching people how to work in organizations that are in some kind of steady state, right? And I always wonder, is just like I was talking to Ilya Strebilayev, our colleague, about how, sometimes the more finance the worse it might hurt you being a venture capitalist. But the same might be true also of strategy, right? If you're thinking about, okay, how do I look for my my adjacencies? How do I think about building my moats? I mean, a lot of that is useful, but a lot of it can sometimes get in the way. I mean, is there like a continuum, or should we think of these as completely different domains? Is there a way that we can incorporate teaching of being a good founder or being a good investor within the traditional business school paradigm?
Well, I think there's a way to look at strategy, not just as an extension of the present. I think there's a way to look at strategy as saying, how can I do something radically different and start out with a different mindset and just erase where, take a clean sheet of paper. I started out working for Texas Instruments, and they did it from a finance standpoint. Back in the day, they were one of the first companies that did this zero-based budgeting. And that did kill a lot of projects, I know for a fact, and allowed them to do some really cool new stuff. Now, again, I am on shaky ground. I teach entrepreneurship and for early stage companies and venture capital. So this corporate area is definitely where I don't have enough knowledge to credibly teach on it. But if I were to guess, I would think it would be in that strategy side. I don't know, Mike, maybe you have a more learned thought?
Well, I don't know. I guess the other observation is that the established company starts out with a different set of assets and liabilities. So they can have a bias, but they also have assets that they can combine with inflections, right? So if you look at the iPhone, it's a really good example where they used OS X. They used their iTunes software. They used their video playback software. So they had a good suite of software that they combined with this sort of touch interface and the new microelectronics and sensors. But like a startup wouldn't have been able to do the iPhone because a startup just wouldn't have had the portfolio of assets. And so I think that the way that the large company plays offense is they say, I want to use inflections to change the subject, but I need to form a connection between those inflections and something about my franchise that's already there. And I think that's their real opportunity. If that's not what they're doing, then I think usually M&As that, it's more like Facebook buying Oculus. Facebook's like, we don't know the first thing about virtual reality. Let's just go buy a company that's good at that and start over in that space.
Well, I think you point out that timing is really important, right? And so, you can have an inflection and you can be aware of it, but you could get the speed of adoption wrong. I mean, I remember when Amazon first came out, I was one of the early customers, and I just immediately went to buying all my books on Amazon. And I just said, okay, bricks and mortar retail will be dead in like 2 years. And, 15 years later, it's, it was still less than half of all commerce. So do corporations, if they're biased against the speed, are founders maybe biased too much in favor of speed? Do they sometimes fail to understand why are people still going to these bricks and mortar, bank branches and so forth? Is there a bias? Is it sort of a bias in the other direction?
Well, I think so. I mean, and the reason that we thought in terms of inflections, so technology is always improving. And there's these improvement curves, and it could be megapixels per dollar in a camera, or it could be, transistors per dollar in a chip. But an inflection is sort of a turning point, and that's why we use that term. So because you're highlighting sort of this issue, which is probably the biggest risk of all, which is timing. I think timing is the hardest thing to figure out in these things. And so the reason that we started to think about inflections was we said, okay, inflections let you answer the why now question. So if there's a new GPS chip in the iPhone that enables ride sharing, you can explicitly say before the iPhone 4S, you could have had the idea for ride sharing, but you couldn't have implemented a system that embodied the idea. After the iPhone 4S, the question is, are you waiting too long, right? If you wait too long, then somebody's going to get network effects and economics returns from that. So, but the inflection is a good way to kind of say, hey, iPhones are improving all the time, but is there a specific new thing that provides specific new empowerment in a specific new way for specific new people? And that I think is important because it lets you stress test the timing of the idea.
And we're also not saying, I don't think that really need to hit the bullseye. There are several examples of starting your ideas too early, and eventually that, as Mike said, that turning point, that event is actually the way we describe it as an event happens and you're golden. Or the event happened and, like you said, human nature to adopt it, because people's beliefs in it are a whole different kettle of fish. And so maybe that is more slowly. And, like we saw with COVID, telemedicine, which folks had been trying to really push for a while, really took off because of the forced nature of it. And that was the only way we could see doctors during COVID. And then they allowed interstate telemedicine, and as part of that, and we realized how amazing that was, particularly when insurance reimbursed it. So I think you're hit on something, Greg, that I think human beliefs are a key part of this. And, frankly, something maybe we should elaborate on, on the next book or whatever. But I think timing is important, but we're not pretending that you need to hit a bullseye, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and it's also just hard to know, right? It's easier to know in hindsight. But like the thing that I think we wanted to do is help people assess their odds better, right? If all things being equal, if you're able to point to a specific form of empowerment that does it in a specific way at a specific time, you're more likely to be correct about your ability to change the future than if you can't. And so that was the goal, was to kind of say, okay, is there a mindset that you can adopt that increases your odds and that makes some opportunities worth pursuing in spite of the uncertainty? Right.
Now, you guys are in seed stage, right? You're getting really, really early in the investment process.
Sometimes legally ambiguously too early.
Right. And I was wondering, does that require a set of skills that is different from maybe, coming in a bit later? And do you see a trend? It seems like now anybody in their basement, I've talked to some other VCs who said that there might be, in the next year or two, the first one-man billion-dollar company, right? Are we at a stage where the companies can grow so quickly without a huge amount of money that the job of evaluating these companies is going to be very different?
Yeah, it's a tough one. What I think has been happening, if I'm trying to be objective about it, is I think it takes less money than ever to achieve product market fit. So, you have lean startups and you have the LAMP stack and you have AI and you have all these things that make it faster and cheaper. But then once you've achieved product market fit, I think the paradox is usually you end up raising an extremely large amount of money because these markets are global and they can evolve really fast. And so that's the pattern I've really seen, is that 500,000 was the new 5 million, but once you get product market fit, you're raising billions of dollars because you're trying to capture all the upside of the category as quick as you can. And these categories, they go global really fast and they evolve really fast.
So it's kind of like music. You can get your first fans on TikTok really quickly, but if you want to be the next big superstar, you're going to have to sign up with some record company, right?
I think so. And I haven't seen a lot of evidence to suggest otherwise, right? Like, I'd thought that maybe it would be different, but it hasn't played out very different from what I'm seeing.
And I don't know if I see the single person $1 billion startup. I think, in fact, to the contrary, I think there's a move to have deeper technology and deeper thought into companies. And I think they're going to need that manpower to ultimately be huge. But I'm ready to be proven wrong to find that.
And if it's a single person $1 billion startup, I think it'll look less like what we think of as a startup. So, like, is Mr. Beast going to be a $1 billion startup, right? If there was going to be one, it'd be more like that. I think it would be by virtue of a certain person's unique personality that a set of people just gravitate to their personality.
You talk about the importance of getting the right customers. you call, good customers like a co-conspirator. And, to be a successful startup, it seems like anybody who can affect your probability of success has to be on board in some sense. You have to have employees that are super enthusiastic about the idea. You need customers that are just crazy over the idea. You need investors, right, that are nuts about the idea. What does it really mean to talk about a customer, let's say, as a co-conspirator and not as simply a customer who's, deriving some value from what you're offering?
And I thought this was one of the points. I'm glad you brought it up, because I think this is one that is somewhat counterintuitive to a number of the entrepreneurs out there, because they think of it in terms of a funnel, and a sales funnel, and find as many potential customers as you can through a series of steps, win over those customers, and like you said, try to win over as many as possible within that funnel. And we're saying something different, that you should look at those early customers as co-conspirators. They should be in on this subversive act that you're doing of upsetting the status quo. They should be desperate for your product. They say, I've been waiting for you my entire life to have this particular product come through. They're excited about it. They're ahead of you on promoting it even to other customers, because they're an evangelist and they're a co-conspirator in that regard. And if you do get that base and you keep to that base, you'll find that it propels your company in a way that the traditional way of trying to pander to every customer and diluting your message and your company, even though that may get you a bit more sales at the start, it's not going to have the same velocity as you will if you have co-conspirators.
Right. And so that means saying no to certain customers.
It does. And firing those customers.
And it also means saying no to certain investors. I mean, I think people who are on the outside of Silicon Valley don't realize the extent to which you guys have to pitch, right, to these founders. I mean, what you mentioned already, what you should be looking for, right, when you're seeking out an investor. Maybe talk a bit more about that, right? I mean, what kind of fit do you need to have? Do you need to have a shared vision of these inflection points, or is it enough to find some other commonality or some observation about the other party that you're dealing with?
Well, we suggest in the book you want to avoid the comparison trap. So when you're talking to investors, you want to make sure, if all the investors you're talking to say, "Oh, I love what you're doing," we believe that's actually a bad signal. And that you have something that's
consensus. That means
that's so close to the consensus that you're, at the very least, even if it's a great idea, you're going to have just a bunch of competitors, because there's a lot of believers out there. To your question, Greg, and I think it's a great one, because I talk this way to the students, and they say, "So you're saying I've been rejected by 10 VCs. That's a good thing so far?" And I said, well, in a way it is. Yeah, you still need to find the one or two that are the co-conspirators and believers. But it's really saying something more than that. Not that you are rejectable, okay? It's saying you have an idea that's so radical that some very smart, savvy investors are saying, "I can't back that. I hear what you're saying. I hear about your insight, but I just don't believe that's going to be true." And we're trained to not do that. In fact, again, I taught otherwise, that you try to reach some commonality with that investor. "Oh, you believe in Bitcoin, so here's a Bitcoin aspect of my product," or this is how I'm going to dilute my message to agree with you.
Well, it's important to find out the reason why. I mean, if they're rejecting you because, "Oh, I've seen someone who's doing exactly the same thing, but they're better than you," that's a different signal,
That's the point.
right?
Yeah. You just don't want to come out as being rejectable. But if they are saying, "I don't believe in your insight," or "just don't believe that's going to be true," or "you're too early," or other signals that you get, that's actually a good sign. Having said that, you still have to find those co-conspirators, those true believers, those investors that will back you. But being rejected is par for the course.
Yeah, one of my favorite recent examples is the Tesla Cybertruck. So like, the Tesla Cybertruck, when I first saw him launch it many years ago, at first I thought he was kidding, right? I thought this can't be what he's really going to do. And sure enough, they basically released that product. And I still don't really know what I think about it, right? I saw it the other day and I was like, and a lot of people I know think it's ridiculous. They just think it's absurd. But one thing I know for sure is nobody ever says, how does that compare to an F-150, right? Like, it's like with the Cybertruck, it's like, be in Elon's future or don't. But there's it forces a choice and not a comparison. And I thought it was funny in the last week, Rivian was talking about how they were doing, and Gavin Newsom said something nice about Rivian. And all of these Tesla zealots came out of the woodwork on what's now called X and just dogged on all the Rivian fans, right? And those are co-conspirators, right? Those are people. And so co-conspirators are not animated by features and benefits. They're animated by belief. They buy not for practical reasons, but for aesthetic reasons. And so they believe aesthetically in the future that Elon is proposing. We don't all have to agree with it, but he forces you to take a stand one way or the other. And so great startup products tend to have that quality. And so what they do is, rather than try to appeal to everybody and try to look at every VC in the world as like a sales cycle and a funnel, they say, okay, there's a limited subset of people in this world who truly value my advantage. I need to spend all of my time with them and only them. And any other time is a waste of time. Same is true of customers, same is true of early employees. And so you want to find the people who believe in the stand that you took and who want to take that stand with you, right? And who want to evangelize it with you. And any other energy is wasted ergs of energy that you can't afford to waste.
Well, are there major differences between what it takes to be a successful founder and what it takes to be a successful venture capitalist? I mean, a good founder might have, 3, 4 companies in them over the course of a lifetime, but a good investor can have, dozens potentially. Is that a different type of personality, a different type of skill? I mean, you have to get up to speed much more quickly, right? You have to rely on sort of very, very quick judgments to some degree. I mean, can you make that transition? I mean, what we've seen is that most venture capitalists at one point were either founders or operators. Are those different skill sets? Are there good overlaps? If you are a good founder, is that more likely to make you a good investor or vice versa?
Well, I think, as you said earlier, knowing when to help and knowing when not to help is, to me, the lesson I learned. My wife ran her own business, and I learned that very clearly, when I should help her and when I should not. So I had that lesson early, but I do think it separates a good VC from other VCs. But to me, the big difference, because I get this question a lot, because entrepreneurs or students are deciding, do they want to take the entrepreneurial track or the investor track, which is, again, hard to believe you can come out of business school and be,
right. That's a new
an investor.
Thing. Yeah.
Fortunately, it's becoming a little less trendy, but it's still out
there. Or that
there.
you'd wonder which one you want to do. It's hard to reconcile the two. Yeah.
But it is, to me, the difference is it's indirect. Is when you're an entrepreneur, you can directly change things. And so if there's a threat out there or there's an opportunity, you can get in there and get that joy, that excitement about literally changing the world. And with an investor, I don't know, Mike, maybe, again, there's a difference of thought here. Even though we like to think we're integral to that change process and that excitement, you're still one step removed, at the very least, from the road there. And it's exciting when great things happen and cheer those entrepreneurs on, but it's not the same as being directly involved, no matter how closely you're connected with the company or even a co-conspirator. And to me, that's the difference. And there are ramifications then on how you handle stress in that indirect versus direct situation, how you communicate to people, just like we were talking about, because there's a lot of, we talked about CEOs being a jerk. So there's no shortage of VCs that are similarly inclined. So it's there's a lot of ramifications, but to me, it's that direct versus indirect. I don't know, Mike, your thoughts?
The only other thing that I've sort of noticed is a lot of people think about what type of a business person is an entrepreneur. And what I've come to believe is that the right way to think about it is they're more like an artist. They're more like an artist than they are like an engineer or a salesperson or anything else. And by that, I mean two things. First of all, artists notice something that other people don't notice, right? Like most of us see a blank canvas and, Picasso paints Guernica, right? Or Van Gogh paints Starry Night, or somebody sees a block of marble and Michelangelo sees Pietà. And then the other thing that artists do is they convince people to abandon their logic. And so, like, no rational employee would join a startup. No rational customer would buy from a startup. No rational investor would invest in a startup. So the founder has to convince all of us to abandon logic and go on a journey where we're 85% likely to not succeed. And so, but when you realize, when you go to like St. Peter's Basilica and you see Pietà, you forget everything you learned about that statue in art history because you're just transfixed by it. It just has this quality that just moves you past your logic to your emotions. And so the best founders I've ever met have those attributes of the artist. And they have the artistry to notice from their sensitivity, and they have the artistry to persuade and to convince people of their different future. Whereas I think when you're an investor, it's more like you're more like Peggy Guggenheim, right? You're more like you're more like trying to spot the next Van Gogh or the next Picasso or the next Kandinsky. But I don't think that you just because you know that Picasso's good doesn't mean that you're Picasso, right? Or ever could be, or that you should be an artist at all.
Well, I mean, if being a founder is like being an artist, then that also suggests that it's going to be very difficult to, apply machine learning tools or, generative AI. I mean, you hear these stories.
To pick.
You
do hear this.
Yeah, I mean, you hear these people saying, well, I mean, there's now generative art, right? So, hey, look at all the Rembrandts and crank me out, Rembrandt. It's much harder to say, crank me out a new type of art that is going to wow everybody. But you hear about people saying, oh, give me a entrepreneurial idea, right?
No, you actually see VCs that have their funnel AI directed, and and maybe there is some goodness there because there are some things that can be automated, like Mike talked about his database, and so you could envision that some things could get some help. But when it comes down to that ultimate decision to back that entrepreneur with that crazy idea, I mean, can you imagine, Mike, with I'm going to allow people to drive in or ride in a stranger's car, and it's not legal in various locations. I mean, there's no machine that's going to make that decision. That's going to be good old-fashioned carbon-based humans that is going to make that happen.
Well, you'll be happy. I did take a lift down here. So
nicely done. Yeah.
There you go.
Right.
Well, the other thing is a lot of these startups, there aren't a lot of humans who would decide to invest in it, right? Because it just seems too crazy.
Well, I mean, it seems like by definition, if you are using some kind of machine learning tool, you're going to be, looking at the past, right?
The present.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're going to be doing the kind of pattern matching that you warn against, almost by definition.
Yeah, it's interesting because the more I think about AI, the more I think of it's almost like the microcomputer made mass computation a commodity, and then the internet made mass connectivity a commodity. And I think that the AI is a sea change in mass cognition. And so what it's doing is it's commoditizing previously acquired knowledge. And so what
knowledge as a service.
Exactly. But like when you think about it, you say, okay, then what is the relative value of new knowledge compared to all pre-existing knowledge? I would argue that it's higher, right? So like if your profession depended on knowing pre-existing knowledge better than other people in that profession, I think that is more threatened by AI than professions where you succeed by exploring the unexplored and seeing something that nobody's ever seen before.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think of it as the rise of passive investing, right? So, as we see more and more passive investing, it really creates this premium for those who are really good active investors. And so if you have more and more decisions that are being made by algorithms, the people who can do the kind of things that you do will going to be at a premium.
Yeah, and time will tell, right? If we can be right or not. But it is interesting to say, like with the microchip, all of a sudden software became more valuable, because in a world where computing becomes effectively commoditized, it becomes rate limited by software. And then in the internet with mass connectivity, the things that became valuable were attention. You want to be the system of record. You want to aggregate as much attention and nodes as you can and have these network effects. And rather than Moore's law animating things, it's Metcalfe's law. Well, that would maybe argue that in a world of mass cognition, previously acquired knowledge becomes commoditized, and that knowledge to be acquired in the future becomes relatively more scarce and valuable. But like what we find is that usually there's some type of a shift in power balance between what was scarce and what was abundant, right? And that's what I find kind of interesting. I'm less worried about, okay, are computers going to outthink humans and all that stuff? Are they going to all of a sudden start painting better than Picasso ever could and inventing new styles and all that? Maybe that'll happen, but I don't think we're very close to that happening.
And the only question I have with that, I agree with what you said, and we haven't talked about this obviously, but I thought I'd give it a try here, is I just wonder, when you look at cross-discipline, and I don't know whether you'd call that, okay, that's new knowledge, but I just think there's an opportunity, because I see this in entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs that have 2 different or 3 or 4 different disciplines under their belt and can think across those, they can synthesize new ideas out of that.
Yeah.
And that are not necessarily breakthroughs in their own right, in a sense, but they've applied something, they've applied plant biology to concrete strength or something like that, that is a cross-discipline that certainly I wouldn't have thought of, that the average person wouldn't have thought of. And I just wonder whether there's a AI opportunity there. I don't know.
Yeah, or AI may accelerate creative people's ability to connect more connections.
Right. So that's like operating within multiple frameworks, similar to the idea that you can hold simultaneously 2 contradictory beliefs, right?
Yeah. So like, I'll give an example of where it might. So, I have this collection of 100-bagger startups. And so the other day I went into Claude and ChatGPT and said, what are all of the reasons that people buy from startups? And then they give you a list and you say, is that list MECE? And then they say, well, actually, now that you put it that way, it's not MECE. I'm like, can you make it more MECE? And I did it in parallel at ChatGPT and Claude, and they converged on a set of 12 factors. So then I uploaded my document of 100-bagger startups, and I said, please consider the following document of like 100-bagger startups. Would you please rank in order these 12 value propositions next to each startup? And like, that's pretty cool, right? And it's like, okay, now the AI did something for me clearly, but I had to bring some creativity to the exercise, right? I had to have been thinking about 100-bagger startups all the time to connect those dots. And so like that would be an example of something you could have never done. You could have
like
never
using Excel for your ideation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that a lot of the theories of creativity are basically that creativity is about forming new connections, and in some ways inflections are like new dots to connect. And you're trying to, and so if you collect more dots and connect them in new ways, you're more likely to find the new pattern that's the better explanation, right, of things.
Well, I want to circle back to where we began, because you said at the beginning of the book that you worried that you might just be that lucky fool, right? And I wonder, how do you evaluate or audit your decision making? We in business school, we talk about how you don't want to reward people for good outcomes. You want to reward them for good decisions. So how do you know if you're actually making good decisions? I mean, you talked about having an anti-portfolio. I mean, can you actually get a good handle on your false positives and false negatives and figure out whether or not your decision-making criteria are actually, good ones? And can you then sort of figure out how you might refine it, improve it? How do you engage in both auditing and how do you design a program for continuous improvement of your decision-making?
Well, we're already seeing an effect with these stress tests that we have in the book. And this is something that's very visible, close to what you're heading towards, and we'll see if we can give it everything that you asked for. But we're seeing people who thought they had a breakthrough idea and using a stress test to say, no, I don't think this is as big an idea, and I don't want to spend 3 to 5 to 8 years of my life doing it. So we're seeing that happen, and that's real. Now I'll let Mike handle the harder part of the question of, is this going to make you or help you find breakthroughs or help someone to actually make a breakthrough?
Yeah. So, I guess the way I like to think about it is, it kind of comes back to the decision making. You mentioned conflating the decision with the outcome, right? And so my favorite thinker on this topic is Annie Duke, right? So she would call this resulting. So like there's the famous example she gives is you're the Seattle Seahawks and you're Pete Carroll. You got Marshawn Lynch in the background. You're on the 1 yard line and instead you throw the ball and it's intercepted by the Patriots. Game over. Isn't Pete Carroll stupid? And what Annie Duke would say is, well, you can't just say he was stupid because he ran that play. You have to say there's a metaverse of potential outcomes depending on what play, If you throw the pass and he drops the pass, you get to run another play. If you run the play and Marshawn gets tackled for a loss, maybe it's game over. That's one factor. But like you can't just say based on the outcome whether that was good or bad. And so when we make decisions at Floodgate now, when we do an investment thesis, we don't say, here's why I think this investment will work. What we instead say is, given that even in 10X funds, only 15% of the companies move the needle, how big does it have to be one of those top 15%, right? So it's really more of a conditional probability, right? It's like, how big does it have to be in the 15% upside case, given that it's 85% likely to not be the upside? Because what we don't want to do later is 2 years from now, it's like, hey, dummy, you said this investment was going to work. It didn't work, because what matters is the magnitude of the upside when it does work. Because losing money isn't what causes you to lose money in venture. Passing on Airbnb is what causes you to lose, right? And so that's what you got to avoid.
And Mike, are you saying they have like the potential energy to be huge?
I think
that's
so.
That's a term you've used before that I think works really well here.
Yeah, so you have some ideas where they find some white space in a market, and if it works, you might make 10 times your money. But the problem is that's still a risky idea. There's a whole bunch of reasons it could fail that you don't even know about yet. And so I think that it's like in the rare event that you're right, you have to be spectacularly right. And so that's why I started to study the 100-bagger. So if you want to have a 10X fund, about 6% of your investments need to be 100X on the first check, and about 9% need to be 20X.
Well, I guess what I was asking is, venture firms talk about their investment thesis, but this seems to be kind of a moving target. I mean, you talk about how you said no to Airbnb. Right?
Yes, unfortunately. Yep.
And so, did that change the way in which you evaluated startups, realizing that you'd passed on that? And I guess the corollary of that is, as you start to take your decision-making and make it more explicit, perhaps by writing a book like this, does that help you to improve it over time?
I think it for sure has, and it's interesting, right? So there's Airbnb, but there's other ones we've passed on too. Figma, Pinterest the first time around. There's others that we wanted to do that we didn't get a chance to do until it was too late, like GitHub. But here's the main thing I've learned is it's tempting to do a postmortem on the ones that don't work, and just understanding why it was foolish to write a check for a company that didn't work. That's one way to do it. But I do think that we're better off if we say, are we seeing the ones that did? And when we see them, are we saying yes? And are we winning them? And when we're not seeing them, why is that? When we're not saying yes, why is that? What can we learn? And even then, it's a humbling game. You know, you study these 100-bagger startups and you try to get a time capsule of exactly what it was like when you would have had to decide. I mean, Zoom, we didn't see it, but it was called SASB at the time, and it was a consumer product. I mean, you would have had to find some way to know. And so you're always going back in time and asking yourself, okay, the frameworks as we've defined them here, is there any way we would have said yes to this company using these frameworks? Or is there something else that we're missing here, right? Is there something these frameworks aren't comprehending?
But you are finding you're using these frameworks, and it has changed to give a...
But we're always kind of saying, okay, what if we're falling in love with our frameworks? And it's like, okay, now let's look at Zoom. Would you have noticed the inflection? Would that have really caused you to do the investment? Okay, would you have really noticed the insight based on this pitch right here? I think it would have been founder future fit. I think that would have been the thing that would have caused you to say yes to it. That would have been the strongest signal.
But look, by taking this tacit knowledge, making it explicit, and then publishing it, I mean, aren't you in a way?
There you go. This is something I said, Greg. I love it. I was going to mention it, but I'm glad you did, because I said
you're open sourcing your competitive
Mike is
advantage,
doing an
right?
amazing thing. He really is.
Yeah.
He, I'm teaching. I enjoy seeing students succeed, and hopefully they can use this, and it has more power to them. But this is part of Floodgate's venture strategy, right, Mike?
Yeah, I think so. But
and he's willing to share this with the world, and I just think that's incredible.
I mean, is it good for you in the end? I mean, look, Tesla open sourced powered chargers. Facebook, open sourced Llama. They didn't do this as a charitable act. I mean, in some ways it can help, right? I mean, and to some extent, I guess, at the end of the day, there's still this apprentice model. I mean, there's tacit knowledge and there's explicit knowledge. And at the end of the day, the open source tools are insufficient to turn you into a good venture capitalist, right?
I think so. And it was just two thoughts on this. One is, I've learned, for better or worse, I've had my best luck when all I thought about was what would the founders get benefit from. And so when we started Floodgate as a seed fund, it wasn't that we were thinking relative to VCs. It was like people like Kevin Rose were saying, I can't raise $1 million in Silicon Valley. And so it was like, we need to come up with a product that's valuable for those founders, because lean startups are starting to happen. But we weren't like trying to disrupt VC or Sand Hill Road or any of that. So it was just like, there's an unmet need in the market. We're listening to the founders. We noticed something. Ironically, I was probably living in the future at the time without even knowing it. And so when I look at this, I'm like, okay, I believe that too many founders pursue ideas that aren't worthy of their time and talent, and that they deserve to apply their time to the things that are the best, highest use of their talent. And if we could help in any way, help them think about their ideas and what to pursue and what to, double check on before devoting their time, that would be valuable, right? That would do something helpful in the industry. But then the other thing I've seen is that, like, everybody knows how Buffett invests. And people I admire in the VC business, Mike Spicer, you know exactly what Mike Spicer's going to do. I could tell you his playbook, right? Roger Ehrenberg, who recently decided to go into business with his sons, you always knew what a Roger Ehrenberg deal would look like. But there's just value in consistency, right? And like most people, they go from one framework to the next and one new version of the truth to the next. And a lot of the people I've seen succeed in investing just have a temperament advantage, right? Like Buffett, Munger, they just had a temperament advantage, and they were just more interested in studying Fortune 500 companies and whether they created value than the next guy was.
Right.
And so,
But I think you're also modestly understating Floodgate as a thought leader in this area. I think you guys have been, and I think being able to help us put this book forward without redacting portions of it is really showing that you're a thought leader on this, and that we discovered something new and important out there that overrode the concern about a competitor.
Yep.
And that's the sign of a thought leader. And I just think you deserve that, whether you will say it or not.
Well, I appreciate that. It's a better treatment than I deserve.
Well, I mean, last question. I mean, you guys are both doing some teaching, right, over at GSB. And, a lot of people would say, there's only so much you can teach people in the classroom, right? But students are coming into business school with the goal of becoming founders and also becoming venture capitalists. When I was in business school, nobody ever would say, I want to be a venture capitalist. I want to go work at Goldman. I want to go work at McKinsey. And now it's a stated ambition of a lot of students. How much value can we really add in the business school setting? I mean, when you're recruiting for new associates, does it help to have some formal training, some formal education in this domain?
Formal training in
investing?
In investing, I think it does, but we're, just to be clear, this is beyond investing. This is for entrepreneurs and investors. So
right, or even to be a founder. I mean, we're going to take a class on how to be a founder, right? We're going to learn some best practices, right? We're going to learn some of the patterns.
Yeah, maybe this is more to the question or the answer you're driving towards is, I believe you really have to be a founder. You can't just. I mean, I can teach and talk about it, but it's really just to encourage them to say, I need to find this for myself, so that she leaves business school and either founds her own company or works with somebody because she said, I need to understand what it needs to be a founder. I am a firm believer, after going through business school and doing with entrepreneurial work and VC work now for a long time, that you have to be in the game to know the game. And if that's where you're heading with the question, I definitely believe. But having said that, I do believe we are not exposing the students to a wide range where they say they want to become an entrepreneur and we only teach them entrepreneurship. And that's what I love about my course is I have the privilege of being able to teach entrepreneurs and investors who come into the class. I find, I ask who's which. I teach them both sides of the table. And I believe that's very effective for even the entrepreneur who will never be an investor to understand that other side of the table. Or if they decide they may want to change careers later, they've gotten a sample of how it is. Maybe that answers your question a little better.
No, it does. I think that's a big part of education now. I think it's just exposing people to people in the field and helping them to see things from different perspectives.
Yeah. So one thing I'm wondering about these days, and you folks would probably have a better handle on this than I do, but business schools basically got started 100 years ago, and
even more.
Yeah, and they were started because you had companies like Standard Oil and Corning and Ford, and people were noticing that there were these far-flung corporations, and the modern corporation, it needed salaried managers, it needed accounting, it needed corporate strategy, they needed to think about managerial economics and all these different things. And the stuff we take for granted about business today didn't exist back then, right? Like those ideas had to be invented as a response to the Industrial Revolution. And so I think that one way I like to think about entrepreneurship for tech startups is we're at the beginning of infinity of our understanding of it. And that up until pretty recently, most business theory about entrepreneurship rehosted business techniques to the entrepreneurship. It's kind of like giving an artist a paint by number kit. And I think that there's a wide frontier of available understanding, I think, about what it takes to do brand new things, like startup capitalism as opposed to corporate capitalism.
Well, I mean, I think the things that they need to learn are some of the things that you talk about in the book. I mean, they need to understand how to become better noticers. They need to understand cognitive flexibility. They need to understand how to stress test. They need to understand, right, how to know the difference between comparison and choice.
How to take advice and not take advice.
How to take advice.
Be disagreeable.
Exactly. Yeah. And so in some sense, those things are less, textbook content and more dispositional, more cognitive, right? It's more about learning how to think in a particular way. And I think that's where we can potentially add the most value in business schools.
I think we do. And as long as, and Stanford's been great about this, as you know, Greg, on this, is that the freedom to talk about ideas that are new themselves about new things is something we're permitted to do. In other words, there's not a research basis for this like you would see in other fields. And that's why we wanted to start the conversation on this ideation area, because we thought it really hadn't been explored enough to cover these specific ideas. And so fortunately, we're able to talk about that. But we also know that next year or the year after, someone is going to figure out something that either confirms what we're talking about or expands it or is contrary.
Falsifies it.
Yeah, falsifies it. And Stanford allows us to do that. And that's really been nice to be able to do.
Well, Mike, Peter, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Greg.
The book is called Pattern Breakers. Check it out. Why Some Startups Change the Future. And you could have a subtitle in there, Why Some Investors Change the Future.
Well, or watch it change.
Yeah, or why some corporations change the future. Yeah, we had 3 audiences to be concerned about, but we chose startups on the cover because that has been our bailiwick, and so it's worked out pretty well that way.
We'll hope to continue the conversation again soon.
Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.